Hey, what's up? It's Jesco again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. It's time for another YouTube Questions Knowledge Bomb. Whee! So this is the section where I answer your YouTube comments questions, because I don't get in there often enough. I feel a bit guilty, and I also want to just give back to the YouTube community. But before I do that, if you're currently in the market for bass traps, low-end control for your studio, you're looking online at different products, resonance traps, porous absorbers, different types of combined traps, maybe tube traps, and you're wondering what is the right solution for your room, where should you invest your money, then I want you to check out my complete guide to bass traps and bass trapping, which you can download for free at the link in the description. It's kind of an encyclopedia of all the different types of bass traps out there, both DIY and off-the-shelf solutions. I've compiled it all into a nicely laid out document for you, so you can really check out and find out what all these different products actually do, how they're supposed to work, how you're supposed to use them, how many you should get. It's really useful if you want to just figure out what the is going on with all these different types of traps and what the right solution is for you. So if you're in the market for a bass trap and you're wondering what you need to do, please download my complete guide to bass traps and bass trapping, figure out what you actually need, and then make your decision based on that. So with that, let me jump into the first question here. This one is by Shwanmaru. Gotta love YouTube names. So this is on a video called Studio Speakers, Should You Get a Second or Third Set of Monitors? And this person says, what do you think about using small full-range speakers like Multimedia iLoud in super near field, about 30 to 50 centimeters, to minimize room influence? Could this be a good idea for a second pair? And the answer is sure. Yeah, give it a shot. I mean, remember that this is supposed to help your creative process in mixing. It's any second pair or third pair of speakers ideally should give you another insight into what is going on inside your music in order to support your workflow. Yeah, so for some people that might mean really big full-range speakers somewhere set up in the room, maybe even a PA system. It might mean a hi-fi system. It might mean a little kind of boom box or a mono speaker. If you're thinking about these small Multimedia iLoud, go for it. Yeah. Me personally, I'm not the biggest fan. The smaller the speaker gets, and especially if it's attempting to be a full-range speaker, it must create more distortion, because you just can't get reduced distortion from a small speaker like that. And in my opinion, it really helps if the speakers don't distort all that much, even if you can't hear it. So I'm not the biggest fan. I'd rather go for a mono speaker, yeah, cutting away, like with a single driver, even cutting away the low end and the high end, so you really focus on the mids. I find that's really the first most useful complement that you can get on top of your standard stereo pair. But yeah, again, I think it's all about experimenting with different types of playback systems and seeing which ones give you the most useful insight to support your workflow. Yeah, and then you can do whatever you want. Yeah, so go for it. This next question is by Aaron Green 3802 on a video called Does Your Acoustic Treatment Actually Work? This is my review on Audium IR analysis. And Aaron says, is it possible to have too much bass absorption? If so, what would be the limits before negatively affecting room sound response? And the simple answer is no. You can't have too much bass absorption, mainly for practical reasons. You can't actually fit so much bass absorption in your typical home studio that it would potentially become a problem. Yeah, and even then, I don't even see how going too much with your bass absorption could create problems. Yeah, you got to remember that what's basically happening, the more you remove the room from the equation of what you're hearing, the closer you get to just the original response of your speakers. Yeah, so the cleaner and more detailed the sound will basically be. And at some point, if you kind of play with this thought experiment, I guess you kind of go towards mixing in an anechoic chamber, yeah. So or even just putting your speakers up out in a field somewhere, so there's no room left to cause any type of distortion. And then it's a matter of debate, yeah, if this is a problem or if this can cause a problem while you're mixing, if you're only listening to your speakers and there's no room response around you. Me personally, I don't think it's any problem. You can adapt to any type of situation. If it works for you, then go for it. Yeah. So coming back full circle, can you have too much bass absorption? Definitely not. Mainly because in your typical home studio, you just don't have enough space to put enough bass absorption to even remotely get to what you're suggesting. Yeah. So it's quite the opposite. You really want to use every single spot in the room where you could even remotely potentially use bass absorption. You want to plaster it all. You want to get as much bass absorption in there as you can possibly squeeze in, and it's probably still not going to be enough. Yeah. So don't worry about too much bass absorption. It's not a real life problem, but it's a good question. So here's one from Hope Prophecy on a video called Home Studio Acoustics, Why You Can't Calculate How Much Treatment You Need. And he says, how many panels do you have in the room that you are speaking in? Do you have any 2x4x4 inch thick bass traps in there? So first of all, I have a ton of bass traps in here, but they're not 4-inch deep, they're 6 inches deep. And how many do I have in my room? Let me just count them. So I have 2, 4, 5, 11, 15, that's then 25, 27, 29, and then the front, so that would bring that up to about 32, and so 38. Am I missing something? No, so I have 38 6-inch deep 2x4 foot bass traps in my room. And this is, for me, for now, it's good enough. You could definitely still do more. Yeah, but so this is kind of the ballpark of the amount of panels you really need to do a first attempt at fully treating a room with panels. So that's kind of where I land. Yeah, good question. Don't go with 4-inch bass traps. 4-inch traps are not bass traps. They're just panels. They're just porous mid and high frequency absorbers. Don't call them bass traps. Okay, so this next one is again by Shwanmaru. Oh, gotta love your name. This one is on Hybrid Studio, how to combine mixing and recording acoustics in a home studio. And he says, I have a not so small room, about 60 square meters. That's a large room. I can build a wall and divide it into a small control room and a small recording room, or I can use the entire space as a hybrid room. What do you think would be better in terms of acoustics? For sure, the bigger room. Because with 60 square meters, if you divide that up and you need to do proper isolation between the spaces, because otherwise, why would you do it in the first place? And then you end up with two rooms that are going, I mean, they're still going to be fairly big rooms. Yeah. So now we're talking probably like 25 to 30 square meters, which is roughly the size of my room here. But then you're really starting to get into the realm where room modes, well, in any case, if you shrink the room modes are going to move up in frequency. And the smaller the room gets, the more all the room modes sit in the like audible spectrum, and especially in the bass region that is highly congested with music, let's say it like that. Yeah. And the less you have of that, the better. Yeah. So it's always better to just work in a big room. Acoustically speaking, the bigger the room gets, the easier it is. Obviously, you still need to cut down the reverb time, so you still need a huge amount of absorption, but you're not going to be fighting the same small room problems that you typically have in small rooms. Yeah? So it makes it easier in that way. And then there's the whole question of the creative flow while you're recording. I personally prefer to just be in the same room with everybody. It saves you on a lot of, obviously, technical solutions to make communications possible, but it's also just more fun to just stay together, I find. And so in terms of acoustics, stick to the bigger room. Obviously, you still need to treat it, and then ask yourself the question of workflow. Do you prefer to just have your performers that you're recording, that you're mixing right next to you, or do you want them to be in a separate room for whatever reason? Yeah, good question. So this next one is by Grabbet. This one's called Home Studio Acoustics. How does unavoidable furniture affect the room? And he says, so should we assume you have 2 identical sofas in your room? Jokes aside, do you recommend to have the more symmetrical room possible to avoid pan shifts? No, I don't have 2 identical sofas. I have that one. And I mean, your question is almost philosophical, right? Because, of course, when you're just asking the question of ideal acoustics, yes, everything is perfectly symmetrical. Yeah. Does that mean you need that in practice? No. Especially in the back of the room, the more asymmetry there is, or asymmetrical kind of components in the room, furniture, sofas, and that sort of thing, the further they are from your listening position and your speakers, the less of a problem they cause. Yeah. Obviously, it does show up, but is this going to stop you from mixing a record properly? Definitely not. Yeah. So you always just got to ask yourself, like, are we talking practically speaking, using the room, feeling good in the room, or are we talking theoretical acoustics? What's the perfect solution? Yeah. Those answers are not going to be the same. Yeah. If you're just asking for the perfect acoustic solution, then yes, you're going to be in a room that has no furniture in it. It just has speakers. It has a little kind of chair you sit on, not even a desk. You maybe you don't even have a screen. You're just wearing goggles. I don't know. Yeah. So you always got to ask yourself, how far do you want to take this towards an ideal that is potentially unobtainable and also very impractical? Yeah. But yeah, so I think as long as everything is symmetrical around your speaker and listening setup, yeah, you're pretty much fine. Good question, though. All right. Here's one by Bart Ronsk. And he says, on the same video, Home Studio Acoustics, how does unavoidable furniture affect the room? He says, I have a question related to this rule of absorber reflector depth versus wavelength that puzzled me for a while. If the sound waves don't see thin objects, how thin the thin is depends on the frequency. Not sure what you're saying there. Does standing wave and room mode calculation make any sense for lower frequencies and in normal houses and apartment buildings? Most walls and often ceilings and floors are not thick enough to be an obstacle for the wave. No. And this makes empirical experimental sense outside of a club or having annoying neighbors. All we hear is the lowest thumping bass as those go through even multiple basement walls. But then why use standing wave and room mode calculation for anything below 80 and 100 hertz? Can the modes form in such an environment? Yes, they do. Obviously, also empirically and experimentally speaking, everybody who's done any amount of low-end work will know that their room has low-end room modes, yeah, so below 100 hertz. So they do absolutely form in such environments. And the reason, obviously, is that even thin walls still reflect a high amount of energy. Yeah, so those room modes will still form, but because not the full amount of energy is reflected, some of it will pass through, the actual amplitude of the sound wave coming back is going to be lower. Yeah, so those room modes form, but they're not going to be as strong in amplitude, right? In terms of if these low frequency sound waves see the walls, absolutely. Yeah, just because the walls aren't the full size of the wavelength doesn't mean that a partial reflection can happen, right? So I always say the size of the object has to be roughly the same size as the wavelength. Yeah, but obviously this isn't an on or off question. It's not like when we're talking about 100 hertz, which has about 3-meter wavelength, that object needs to be a circle of 3-meter diameter. And if it's 2.8 meters in diameter, now suddenly that sound wave doesn't see that object anymore. Or let's say we're not talking about a circle, the surface isn't a circle anymore, but now it's a kind of a narrow board, yeah? Like a, I don't know, some sort of piece of wood that is 3 meters long and 1 meter wide, yeah? Again, that sound wave doesn't suddenly not see this object, but you get partial bending around it and partial reflection, yeah? So as a rule of thumb, you can probably say the wave starts seeing the object once it's about half the size of the wavelength. That's where it kind of starts to have a glimpse at this object, and then the larger this object gets towards the size of the wavelength, the more you get energy reflected off of it. Yeah, it's a good question. I've thought about this as well, and whenever I find some sort of reference towards how this works, I pay close attention because it's not that easy. Yeah? Obviously, the shape of the objects has an impact on how that sound wave gets reflected. Obviously, the diameter, the size, the material, like you're suggesting with these walls, if it's thin drywall, right? All this comes into play. So it's not an on or off thing. It is very much a how much thing, you know? But yeah, room modes can totally form in rooms, even with thin drywall walls below 100 hertz very easily. And so these calculators do make sense. How useful are they? That's a whole other topic, but they do absolutely form. Yeah? Good question. So here's one by Giorgio Vallotti 4129 on the video Home Studio Acoustics, how does unavoidable furniture affect the room? And he says, you pointed out the relationship between the length of a surface and its ability to reflect sound waves. So this is on the same topic. How does the relationship change with curved surfaces? Well, hard to say, right? Hard to give a kind of this is exactly how it happens. Obviously, once you're talking about curved surfaces, and depending on which side of this curve, this curved surface the sound wave hits, it either gets scattered or it gets focused. Yeah. That's probably as much as I can say on top of what I just said for the previous question. So there's a whole lot of it depends in there. And yeah, I'm not even sure how to answer this in a better way. I mean, this is where it gets very, very tricky to imagine exactly what's going on. Yeah, this is so situation dependent. That's it's hard for me to give any other answer, to be honest. Sorry, but good question. Yeah, it's fun thinking about this stuff. Don't get too obsessed about it because you'll go crazy. So one final one on a video, an old one called Bass Traps. Can they take away too much bass? By Mr. Wealth. And he says, do those Amazon bass traps reduce bass from getting into other rooms? So first of all, I don't know what Amazon bass traps you're referring to, but in my opinion, Amazon does not sell any proper bass traps. They call them bass traps, but they're not really bass traps. And in general, absorption in the room doesn't really help with sound transition to another room, right? Or rather, you gotta separate isolation and acoustics in the room. Right? They're two different things. They're both the part of the science of acoustics, but we're talking about two different things here, and the methods on how to make them work are also very different. So does the acoustics in the room, if you're using bass traps, if you're using absorption, does that help with sound getting to the other rooms? As a rule of thumb, I would say no. Yeah, don't expect it to. There will be some small effect, but it will basically be negligible to the point where it's not really useful to talk about it in that way. Yeah, so for obvious reasons, there's some sound energy gets absorbed, and obviously that absorbed energy can now no longer traverse into adjacent rooms. Yeah, there's also kind of a side effect of the the room getting quieter usually, and so you don't tend to work so loud anymore. So you're just putting less energy into the room when you're working, and that obviously has the effect of also having less energy in any adjacent rooms. Yeah, so there's some sort of secondary effects that will lead to a little less bleed into other rooms, but this isn't something you can count on, and this is definitely not the solution to isolating yourself from separate rooms. If you want to do isolation, you need to do proper isolation, which is adding massive amounts of mass. It needs to be airtight. Yeah, so the wall, obviously we're talking about the wall here. It needs to be heavy, so you can make it heavier. You can you need to make it airtight. Yeah, and then in order to reduce or even avoid the sound going through the structure, that entire heavy airtight surface ideally needs to be decoupled from the rest of the structure, so that any sound going into that surface, into that structure, cannot couple into the remaining structure of the building and then go through the concrete or whatever and then exit on the other side. Yeah, so the three basic principles of isolation are adding mass, making sure it's airtight, and then decoupling. Yeah, and so as you can tell, this has nothing to do with putting up insulation material on your wall. Yeah, it's two different things. Yeah. But another good question. That's the last one for today. I hope you learned something here. Thanks for asking. Obviously, if you want me to answer your questions in the comments in the future, yeah, ideally make sure they're not too detailed, as in they're not, this isn't about answering your particular questions about how to treat your exact rooms. Yeah, sometimes questions can require a too long answer, and then I usually skip them, yeah, because I want to get more in there. Yeah, so keep your questions short and on point, and then I'd be happy to answer them. But yeah, thanks for everybody contributing. I do read the comments every once in a while because it's kind of rough sometimes, but I do read the comments, and obviously I like doing these videos. Yeah, so keep them coming. So thanks, and with that, as always, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. That's what it's all about. We don't need to discuss acoustics all day long. Let's get into a flow state, make some proper beats, record a beautiful vocal, all those things. I'll see you in the next video.